Tonight's story is written by James Dermond, one of the 6 spooky tales from his book, Doorways to the Unseen 3. The link to that book will be in the description below. Enjoy. The night was very still, but then Thomas woke. He yawned, surprised he had woken at such a late hour after his early bedtime. He rose from his bed and pushed open his sparsely furnished bedroom's window, the moon fuller than he'd seen it for a long time. There was nothing close to his family's house save the bramble woods behind it, which had so far remained unexplored. There was time. After all, they only moved in a few weeks ago. Thomas and his parents had traveled across the country to their new home near his mother's hometown. Mother had taken ill lately, and the doctor had advised a warmer climate to aid her recovery. So the family uprooted themselves. Thomas's father planned to set up shop in the nearby town while his mother recuperated. They might stay forever, even if Mother did become well again, as there was no local blacksmith. The house sat along a country road miles from town and the homes of the neighbors. Occasionally, a horse and buggy would ride by, and every once in a while, one of those fancy Model Ts would sputter past, leaving a noxious trail behind it. The place was old. No one had lived there for years, though it had been maintained by an estate agency somewhere out east. Near to the house was an overgrown abandoned cemetery sheltered by the perimeter of the woods. Thomas had caught glimpses of the cemetery's rusted ornamental gates as he passed, but he had never really given the place much thought. Tonight, however, the moon was so bright Thomas could see many of the cemetery's headstones, as well as the moss-covered mausoleums at the back of the plot. Distracted by the tranquil evening, Thomas didn't notice the thing moving in the cemetery until it came directly into his view. He leaned forward for a better look, his head emerging from the window. A very tall and gaunt man dressed entirely in black funeral garb strode purposefully through the cemetery grounds. He was followed by 2 other men, one short and squat, the other broad and hunched. The moon's pure light flooded the cemetery, casting long shadows behind the 3 men as they weaved between the gravestones. The ghastly trio stopped at a headstone and began to dig, the sounds muffled but still audible from Thomas's perch. The tall man stood over the other 2 as they labored, their shovels scraping against the rocky soil with each thrust. As they dug, the tall man suddenly tilted his head from the open grave and looked straight at Thomas, his eyes seemingly fixed on him. Thomas froze, unsure whether the specter-like man was gazing at him or merely looking up at the house. The tall man then slowly smiled, giving him a wide, sinister grin, erasing any doubt Thomas felt. The hairs on the back of Thomas's neck stood on end, a chill unlike any he had felt before crawling up his spine. The tall man then abruptly turned away, gesturing towards his henchmen. A coffin had been exhumed by their work, encrusted with dirt and bound in heavy chains. The 2 diggers lifted the disinterred coffin by its handles, and the tall man followed them among the trees, the thick oaks of the deeper woods obscuring their destination. Thomas had been holding his breath, but now exhaled. He scanned the woods again for any sign of movement and then sat down on his bed, the mattress springs squeaking under his weight. Those men, they looked almost like corpses, Thomas thought, now taking measured breaths as he opened the top button of his long nightshirt. Hoping no one was in the cemetery to see, he turned the knob of the gas lamp resting on his dresser, the dark room lighting with a soft hiss. The lamp basked the bedroom in a warm glow. Thomas stretched his legs over the edge of his mattress and waited for his nerves to regain some semblance of calm. He stood to shut the bedroom windows, peeking to see if the men had returned, his shadow large against the unadorned walls of the room. After some time, Thomas turned out the light, the silence of the house assuring him his parents hadn't woken. He thought of the wan, cadaverous features of the nighttime visitors as he drifted back into sleep. They'd been closer to animals than human beings. "Here, Mr. Hughes, just sign on this line and then here as well," the estate agent said, coolly professional, but as Thomas sensed in something of a hurry. Thomas had received the man's telegram soon after returning home from the war, which was now thankfully over. Thomas had seen some action in the Western Front, but only after the fighting had moved out of the trenches. The telegram informed Thomas that his father had died while overseas. Mother had died years earlier, shortly after moving into the house. She was taken by a wasting illness, one which hadn't been ameliorated by the mild climate of the coast. Thomas's father had been so broken by the loss that he fell into a deep depression from which he never truly recovered. He sent Thomas away to live with his aunt and uncle who'd raised him into adulthood. "And here are the keys to the house, Mr. Hughes," the estate agent, a Mr. Betts, said, offering a small key ring to Thomas. Thomas placed the key ring in his suit vest pocket for easy access. "I'm also sorry about your father, Mr. Hughes," Mr. Betts said, his tone softening somewhat. "The agency tells me he was buried in the church cemetery in town, and no one attended the funeral. You should visit his grave to pay your respects before taking your leave of this place." "My father wasn't close to the family, Mr. Betts," Thomas replied, reluctant to share anything personal with a stranger, but believing it necessary in this case. "After my mother passed away, my father was seized by a melancholy disposition. It seemed to eat away at him. We rarely spoke after I was taken in by his sister and her husband. And, of course, I've been away these last few years. A few of the locals tell me the elder Hughes was fearful of something living out here in isolation," Mr. Betts said quietly, his formerly reserved manner now hinting at a kind of nervousness. "Cars would drive past at night and there were strange lights in the windows, even at the oddest of times." "Just some country gossip, Mr. Betts," Thomas replied, seeking to reassure the estate agent. "If my father was in danger or something like that, he would have just moved away. He kept up his blacksmith shop until fairly recently, as I understand it." Once the estate agent had said his goodbyes, Thomas watched him drive down the bumpy dirt road not far from his newly acquired house. Selling the property to an interested party would take some doing, as the location was not a favorable one. Thomas had to take the bus and then hitch a ride with a farmer to get there in the first place, but now he could drive his father's old Model T. The car was garaged nearby in a small barn with view of that creepy abandoned cemetery. The memory of that strange night years ago had haunted Thomas ever since, but he rarely consciously thought of it. After going to live with his aunt and uncle, Thomas had sometimes had nightmares of the scene in the cemetery, the bestial faces of those men hovering over him as he slept. With maturity, the nightmares faded, and Thomas hadn't dwelt on that night since. That is, not until his first night sleeping in the old house. Fluffing his pillow, Thomas laid on the same bed he had slept in as a boy. He found his boyhood room almost bare except for a bed frame and mattress with its dresser and lamp. Still, he'd been able to find some bed sheets and pillows in the hall closet. Now laid down for the night, he wondered momentarily if that scene from his childhood might repeat itself. Thomas woke suddenly, shafts of luminous moonlight pouring in through the bedroom window. Still tired from the previous day of travel, Thomas was surprised by how awake he felt. He sat up under his bedsheets, pulling himself from the creaking bed frame. He walked to open the window, resting against the sill to view the woods behind the house. The three men were at work in the cemetery. They had just pulled a chain-bound coffin from its upturned grave and were now placing it on solid earth. As Thomas watched the scene unfold, the tall man, the dwarf, and the hunchback all paused their efforts and turned to look up towards the house. They stared right at Thomas and smiled, their soulless grin so terrifying as to be the stuff of nightmares themselves. Thomas fell back across the small room and slammed into a wall, dropping to the floor in a heap. His palms were plastered against his temples as he noiselessly screamed, the disquieting horror of that night years ago returning to him in an instant. The shadowy bedroom began to spin around him in dizzying circles and then was swallowed by blackness. Thomas woke on the bedroom floor, the rays of morning sun shining on his face. He lay crumpled in a corner of the room, a shallow gash across his forehead from when he had fallen the night before. After staggering to his feet, Thomas put on his pants and shoes and walked outside to the small well in the front yard. He placed his head under the pump's spout, dousing it with cold, gushing water until he felt fully alert and right in his mind again. He toweled off in the front of a hall mirror and examined the gash, wondering if it might need stitches. "I'm going into those woods today while it's light. I'll find where the monster men are taking the coffins," Thomas thought to himself, feeling the dull pain of his wound but still ready to confront his childhood terror. Thomas had never been sure if what he'd seen that night was real, but now he knew. Fully dressed except for his suit coat, Thomas put his Colt Service revolver into his leather holster under his arm and went into the cemetery, stopping at its battered gates. Why do they bury the dead so far away from town? Thomas considered. This place seems like it hasn't been used in decades. I wonder why it's here. The rusted gates opened part way with some effort, and Thomas slipped into the cemetery. The plot hadn't been cared for in many years, its sinking headstones being nearly engulfed by purplish vines, putrid-hued mosses, and sickly lichens. The names on the stones were mostly obscured by both age and the overgrowth. All the ones Thomas inspected seemed to bear the same family name, de San Martin. The name sounded Catholic to Thomas, but there was no evidence of Christian imagery in the headstones or anywhere else in the cemetery. In fact, Thomas couldn't find any religious iconography at all. 2 of the mausoleums at the back of the plot carried this family name engraved above their ponderous doors. The largest of the 3 structures, however, bore only one man's name, that of Ignacio de San Martin. As he left the cemetery to explore the woods beyond, Thomas searched for the disturbed grave he had seen last night. None could be found. The soil around the gravestone appeared untouched by anyone, still covered in the weed-like grass that grew throughout the cemetery plot. There was no clear path through the woods, so Thomas looked for spots of low foliage over which to tread. As he progressed, the woods became denser, the hanging invasive vines now almost black and the heavy oaks gradually contorting into agonized poses. Thorny underbrush tore at Thomas's clothes, his shirt and pant legs repeatedly caught by barbs. At last, he spotted through the leaves of the trees what appeared to be a sprawling house. The faint outline of an alabaster stone footpath led from the colonial-style mansion and disappeared past Thomas deeper into the woods. The house itself, once resplendent in adobe white and red, was now dilapidated. It looked like it had been abandoned long ago, just like the cemetery. The front doors, to Thomas's surprise, were unlocked, and he stepped into the foyer of the hacienda. The sun lit the murky place through the sporadic holes in its raised ceiling, bathing the sun in dim orange light. The floor of the estate was mostly covered with debris from the building itself and its furniture, and a wrought iron staircase led up to the second level. Thomas heard a high-pitched tittering sound as he stepped into the first floor's center. Listening closely, he discovered that the noise was coming from the nearby wall, or so it seemed. The tittering then grew louder. The sound seemed to be coming from everywhere, even from above. Are they rats? Thomas worried as he looked down, hoping none were at his feet. Thomas also considered they might be nesting birds, only he'd seen no signs of animal life as he drew near the mansion. Ascending the unsteady staircase, his hand on its rail, Thomas walked along the open second floor. He paused at a portrait that had fallen from its place along the wall and now rested upright. The walls were lined with many pictures of the family who had occupied the house, but this one stood out to Thomas. The daguerreotype was that of a young woman taken sometime during the last century. Despite the portrait's age, the woman in the picture held a notable resemblance to his late mother. Almost everything about them was the same, save for the clothes of the period. Thomas had never met his maternal grandparents, nor had he ever seen a youthful picture of his mother. He knew her family was from this area. It was why they moved here in the first place. But his mother had died before she could introduce Thomas and his father to the family. There was an iron-bound wooden door leading to an adjoined tower, which Thomas had thought only a folly from the outside. The tittering from earlier had subsided, but now became quite noticeable as Thomas opened the tower door, as if the rats in the walls were becoming agitated. He climbed the worn steps until he came to a circular room at the tower's top. It was an embalming chamber of some sort, with workbenches and iron-manacled tables for subjects. Scattered over a table in no certain order were books and scrolls, some in languages Thomas didn't recognize. Dirt from possibly the grave thinly coated one of the manacled tables. Fresh? Thomas wondered. Is this an undertaker's lab? An alchemist's study? He felt as excited about his discovery as he was perplexed by it. Thomas picked up one of the few titled books from the table and began to turn through its foul-smelling pages. The book was a treatise on vivisection and bloodletting, written in the antiquated English of several centuries ago. One page displayed a diagram of a man's body, the body parts labeled in an incomprehensible script. Leaping ahead, Thomas paused at one line in particular. The flesh and vital organs of the young man of shared blood are to be fed to those afflicted, so as to revive them to sound body and good health. A loud crashing sound shattered the silence. It had come from downstairs. Thomas put the moldy book under his arm and hurried down the tower steps, unbuttoning his holster for quick access to his service revolver. The rats in the walls were now tittering in a frenzy, scurrying about and scratching as Thomas descended the staircase and then ran out through the decaying mansion's doors. More time had passed than Thomas had initially supposed. The early fall sun was beginning to set over his house. He squinted in the low light, exhausted from his return trip through the dense woods surrounding the derelict mansion. He ate several sandwiches he had left in the icebox at the kitchen table, the gas lamp suspended above his head flickering occasionally. Satisfied, he went upstairs and lay across his bed in the dark, the strange book he had taken from the tower resting in the dresser nearby. Mother is somehow intertwined in all of this. I just know it, Thomas thought to himself, the doubts he had always had about her becoming firmer after the day's disturbing excursion. Mother has to be the woman in that picture. There's no other explanation. Thomas's memories of his mother were vague, but something he did remember with certainty was her often cold manner, punctuated by perhaps feigned episodes of warmth. Mother had sometimes seemed as if she was assessing him and his father for some unknown purpose. This behavior grew more obvious as time passed, especially in the months before the family relocated. Thomas rose from the bed and entered his parents' room, turning on the gas lamp that perched atop a dresser. He searched the bedroom dressers and found nothing, all of his father's clothes and belongings having been taken after his sudden death. Opening the large walk-in closet, he found nothing but wire hangers left along the wooden rod. Thomas sat on the barren mattress and stared into the empty closet space, wondering where else he might search. In the dim light, Thomas noticed the faint outline of an irregular panel along the back of the closet. He stood and parted the hangers, reaching out to knock on the panel. Hollow. Bending a wire hanger into a tool, he pried the panel loose, revealing a crevice containing a leather-bound notebook. It was a diary. His mother's. Thomas grabbed the book from its hiding place and began to quickly turn through the pages. The deception has worked. James and my son Thomas have followed me to the family grounds unaware. I am truly ill and I'm not sure how much time I have left, but Thomas's sacrifice will make the family well again, including myself. Only some of us can move about as normal in the daylight. So many of the family have been reduced to little more than beasts, stunted animals that inhabit the burrows and warrens beneath the estate. But for myself, that I could bear a child at my advanced age is astounding. A revelation that inspired Uncle Gaspar to hatch this desperate plan. I may be the last de San Martin female to have produced issue until our family's degeneration is reversed. Once we are ready, those who are buried in the family plot as well as the rest of the de San Martin clan will be made whole, undoing the effects of centuries of consanguineous unions and the corrupting powers of the dark arts. Even our patriarch, Ignacio de San Martin, will be roused from his torpor, hearing and dreaming but dormant while interred in his crypt to rejoin the family he first led into our master's service. The stairs leading to the first floor of the house creaked from behind the closed door of the bedroom. Thomas put aside the diary and slowly drew his firearm from his holster, counting 6 rounds in its chambers. Thomas threw open the bedroom door and fired into the hallway. The deformed shape of a man groaned and fell to the floor, lying face down after taking 2 shots to the chest. Stepping over the body of the hunchback, Thomas crept down the stairs to search for the other 2 grave robbers who had finally come for him. In the house's lightless kitchen, Thomas turned slowly, waiting for an attack from the shadows. The dwarf leaped at him, having been concealed in the dark corners of the room. The half-human creature snarled as it dove forward, grasping at Thomas as it took hold of him. Unable to fire in time, Thomas punched at the dwarf as it bit down on his free arm, sinking its jagged teeth into the flesh under his shirt. Thomas cried out, his wound burning as he shook the dwarf free. The dwarf fell onto the kitchen floor, knocking over a chair as it collided with the table. Thomas aimed in the dark, aided only by the kitchen's moonlit window, and shot the cowering dwarf twice. The first bullet passed through the dwarf's cheek, and the second penetrated its eye, the abomination's gnarled hands falling slack as it died. Thomas ran out through the front door of the house and into the yard. An open coffin, its lid against its side, lay near the porch steps as if waiting for him. Thomas spun and scanned the grounds, his revolver braced and ready. The tall man was nowhere to be seen. Keeping his revolver in front of him, Thomas circled the perimeter of the house, his eyes searching the high bushes and other hiding places around its foundation. There was no hint of anyone nearby, only the nighttime sounds of the woods piercing the silence. He has to be here, Thomas thought to himself. The other two took his orders. They're all members of the same inbred family. My family. He thought back to the stories his father had told him about his mother, that they met when his father had left home to travel to a new town to begin his apprenticeship, that his mother had been the one to introduce herself to his father, and that his mother's family lived far away, too far for them to ever really visit. The sound of falling shingles startled Thomas as the tall man leaped from the roof, striking him on the back with both of his boot heels. Thomas fell forward and dropped his revolver, stunned by the sudden blow to his shoulder blades. The tall man struck Thomas with a closed fist as he rolled over to face his attacker. The hard punch made Thomas see stars, and he spat blood into his white shirt as the tall man grabbed him by the throat. He doesn't want to kill me. The thought flashed through Thomas's mind as he felt his breath being squeezed out of his body by the tall man's unyielding grasp. They still need me for their ritual. Thomas was lifted upward, his feet dangling in the air as his vision grew blurry. He kicked forward and felt his foot connect with the face before dropping to the ground. Dazed, Thomas stood up and saw the tall man sprawled back, the swift kick having taken him by surprise. He went for his revolver, grasping it from the dirt and managing to fire one rush shot. The bullet whizzed past the tall man as he leapt again at Thomas, his black cape unfurled. Knocked down by the tall man's punishing fist, Thomas fired into the adversary's chest, a trail of smoke wafting from the barrel as he spent his last bullet. The tall man paused his assault, staggered by the gaping wound, then took an unsteady step backward. His ammunition gone, Thomas charged and smashed the butt of his revolver into the tall man's sharp nose, knocking off his great-uncle's silken top hat. Thomas struck again and again in a frenzy, breaking the ghoulish face of Gaspard de San Martin, a malignant tumor who should have perished centuries ago. When the figure finally stilled, Thomas rose, panting, bruised and bloodied. He went to the small barn that garaged his father's Model T. From the toolbox in the trunk, he took a crowbar and a dull knife. There were also 2 full jugs of kerosene. With some difficulty, Thomas took these as well. Stalking through the woods past the cemetery at night was an ordeal, but Thomas let the moon and his own memory guide him. The barbs and thorns of the almost impenetrable thickets tore at him as he neared the mansion grounds, only the clanking of the kerosene bottles breaking the same hushed silence as he had encountered on his first trip. The stark mansion stood before Thomas, its alabaster stone path illuminated by moonlight. He went to its now closed doors and broke in with the crowbar, battering the lock until it gave way. Entering, he strode to the center of the grand drawing room, the once sumptuous furniture that littered the floors now only kindling for the fire Thomas planned to set. Thomas splashed the first jug of kerosene about. The tittering in the walls and ceiling above reached a fever pitch as the regressed members of the de San Martin ancestral line realized what was about to happen. As Thomas emptied the second kerosene jug onto the mound of debris, the tittering around him became almost deafening, drowning out Thomas's own manic thoughts. A lit match was flung into the pile, instantly igniting into a bonfire and quickly spreading, beginning to consume the rotting walls of the mansion. Thomas fled the house of his antecedents, a place that had seen so much wickedness and suffering, a place that was now the funeral pyre of his family, both living and undead. He stood at the edge of the woodlands in front of the mansion, watching the structure burn steadily to the ground in a cleansing fire. The evil that had nested there was now being purified, the shrill, piping shrieks of his horrid family ringing into the still night of the dark woods. Thomas de San Martin laughed maniacally as the mansion disappeared behind a wall of flame, a strange, unrestrained laughter that would not stop until the morning light came.